Well, good morning again, everybody. I think even though people continue to stream in the door, we're going to go ahead and get started out of respect for those of you who are already here. And let me start by introducing myself. My name is Frances Seymour. I am a senior fellow at World Resources Institute, but for the purposes of this session and several others, I'm here in my capacity as a U.S. science envoy. And U.S. science envoys are supported by my government's State Department to travel internationally to foster international collaboration on science. But importantly, we travel in our capacity as private citizens, do not represent the U.S. government, so any positions that I express over the course of this session should be attributed to me alone. Just to make sure as people come in, if you were planning to be at the high-level panel on leveraging geospatial monitoring for climate and biodiversity finance, you are in the right place. If you meant to be somewhere else, you should stay here because this is going to be the best one. Yeah, you've chosen well. So what I'm going to do is just make a few opening framing remarks and then call my panel up to the stage. Our objectives for the next 85 minutes, and we're told we really do have to end on time to avoid yesterday's problem of shifting the whole agenda back, are to really focus on the specific opportunities for geospatial data and monitoring to help liberate more finance for nature. And in that broad field, we've chosen a few more narrower things to focus on. And one is to increase confidence in the environmental and social integrity of forest carbon credits. And I'm looking in the audience and seeing several experts on that topic. We also want to explore the extent to which geospatial data and monitoring can help develop measurement of the benefits of both forest conservation and restoration for non-carbon benefits, certainly including biodiversity, but also the non-carbon effects of forests on climate. And last but not least, we also want to understand the degree to which these tools can also help promote the equitable distribution of benefits of market-based instruments to indigenous and local communities. So, Paige, may I have the speaker slide, please? So the speakers that we have lined up here, as you can see, provide a diverse set of perspectives from people who are experts and practitioners in this field. And I'll be introducing them one by one as we go through the session. And if I perform my timekeeping role, and I've got this great little bell up here, so if somebody talks too long, I'm gonna cut them off. Isn't that awesome? I hadn't seen those were available, but I got it, and I'm willing to use it. And on the audience too, just as a warning. Anyway, if we keep on time, there's going to be plenty of time for your interventions. And I do see, all of you as with something to contribute. So whether you, want to use the Slido function, or we might be able to pass a mic around, feel free to put in questions, but also just comments, because your expertise is welcome here. This is a crowdsource thing. We do, I understand, have simultaneous interpretation in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Bahasa. So you can use the app for your language. And that's for the questions. And is there something on the language? No. And because of the live stream, people joining us from remote will also be able to submit questions. So we welcome that as well. I'm going to set the scene in this broader sense of generating finance for nature. And I don't think it's a secret to anybody in this room that we're hurting. We don't have enough finance to do what needs to be done to protect nature. And in fact, there was a report prepared by UNEP, I think in advance of the Montreal conference, that estimated that the current levels of finance flowing to nature, defined as what we need to do to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, to halt biodiversity loss and achieve land degradation neutrality, would need to more than double by 2025, which is like tomorrow, and more than triple by 2030. So we've got just this really steep finance hill to climb. And I think we all also recognize the limitations of public finance to close this gap, including maybe conversations with our funders at this conference who are telling us, yeah, sorry, but we, you know. And so I think that's part of the reason why there's been a shift in attention to market-based mechanisms, you know, as a way of crowding in more private sector finance to the nature conservation and restoration agenda. And in fact, in 2021, there was this big upsurge in carbon markets. And everybody's pretty excited, oh, you know, this is gonna exponentially increase and we're gonna be able to capture all these funds. But then in 2022, the market leveled off. And it's pretty clear that one of the reasons for that leveling off was a kind of worry about the environmental and social integrity of the credits being transacted. And as you're probably aware, you know, adverse press attention to forest carbon credits in general, for example, and so a bit of a hesitation about whether these credits represent real reductions from the point of view of the atmosphere. So important input to this discussion. So responding to these concerns, there's a whole plethora of global initiatives to try to set standards and norms for market-based mechanisms. You've probably heard of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is coming out with their standard later this year. There is something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative Beyond Value Chain Mitigation Guidance, which is out for public consultation right now in terms of guidance for companies on purchasing these things. Specific for tropical forests, there was something called the Tropical Forest Credit Integrity Guide. And I've spent my life over the last 2 years going to meetings about all these things, so you know it's a lot going on, but the fat lady is gonna sing for each one of them over the coming months. So these are live issues right now. Now, most recently, I think following on the Biodiversity Conference in Montreal and then amplified by the meeting that President Macron and President of Gabon hosted in Libreville in March, a big surge of discussion about market-based instruments for valuing biodiversity. And so a new discourse that I understand was on big display last week at the Financing Summit in Paris was discussion about biodiversity credits and creating markets, you know, for those. So for all those reasons, these are in the ether, and in fact, a paper published last week identified as one of the challenges to be overcome for biodiversity credits was to provide credible, timely, and affordable measurement and monitoring of the state improvement and or maintenance of biodiversity. So these are very live issues right now. And last but not least, a cross-cutting concern from carbon credits, biodiversity credits, anything else, is how to ensure that the revenues from such market-based mechanisms actually get to the rights holders and the indigenous and local communities as protagonists in the design and implementation of any intervention, and making sure that they get an equitable share of the benefits. So today's discussion is to focus on to what degree can geospatial monitoring, data and monitoring inform those kinds of market mechanisms and overcome the remaining challenge. So I'm now gonna call my panelists up to sit on the stage with me so they can see the audience for this next exercise. Come on, guys. So before turning to the panelists, both for my role as a moderator but also their role as panelists, I want to take the temperature of the audience to get a sense of like maybe why you came to this session and what you're thinking about in terms of these market mechanisms. And we're not going to use this anonymous tool of Slido, right? You're going to have to out yourself to your fellow participants. And what I'm going to do is ask you to answer 2 questions, and in each case it's a 3-point spectrum, and you have to raise your hand for 1, okay? No sitting quiet with your hands folded, sorry. And I'm going to ding you with the bell if you don't vote. Okay, so you got 3 choices, and the question is to get a sense of your feeling about the potential of these market-based mechanisms to close the financing gap. Just your own opinion right now coming into this session. And you're gonna have to say whether you lean skeptical, like you're really not sure these things are gonna work, or you lean optimistic, you think, you know, there's a good chance we can overcome these challenges, or you're gonna wimp out and say, well, you're not sure, somewhere in the middle, willing to be convinced, okay? We ready to go? All right, choice number one, leaning skeptical, pessimistic, not sure this is going to work. Okay, we got a few brave hands here, all right? How about leaning optimistic? We can do this. Hey, okay. Or still not sure in the middle, willing to be convinced. Okay, we have a majority for the wimp out option. Very good. Okay, now, second question. Regardless of how you answered question number one, I want to have a sense of what you feel is the potential for the geospatial data and monitoring community, all this church that's gathered here in Brussels this week, to help move you from more pessimistic to more optimistic, no matter where you start, okay? So option number one is going to be, there's little potential of data and monitoring to move my opinion. Or there's lots of potential to have better data and monitoring, move my attention. Or again, somewhere in the middle, not sure, want to learn about it, okay? Option number one. There's no potential that geospatial monitoring and data is going to change my opinion. Okay, 3 of you, very good. Oh, 4, okay. Second option, lots of potential here. Man, if you guys can nail this, I'm going to be much more optimistic about markets. Well, okay then. And the not sure wimp out option. Okay, so 2 and 3 are kind of in the, okay, this is great. I hope that was useful to you, panel, to have a sense of where your markets, your audience is coming from. Okay, so we are already at 1:15, and one of our panelists has to leave for the airport at 9:30. So I'm under the gun here. I got my bell ready. But what I'm going to do is introduce each speaker before the first question to save time and make sure she gets in the cab in a timely manner. So I'm going to introduce our first panelist, and she is Minnie Degawan, who's over to the second one in. And Minnie is an indigenous Kankayane Igorot from the Cordillera in the Philippines. And she's the director of a new re-granting fund that you should all know about it, that is focused on promoting integrity in forest carbon markets that's based at Rewild. And she's working with indigenous peoples and local partners and NGOs and donors to support jurisdictional scale initiatives to achieve high integrity emission reductions from forests. Now, on a personal note, and don't be offended as her audience in this, but she told me that she actually prefers to talk to her plants rather than live human beings because they listen better and require less interpretation. Okay, I'm just reporting here. That's what she told me. Okay, so Minnie, the question to you is, I think everybody agrees that indigenous and local communities should have, access to climate finance, nature-based finance in general, and that access to benefits should be commensurate with their role in protecting the forest, which we know is huge. What role, if any, does geospatial data and monitoring have in ensuring that they can negotiate their fair share of the benefits in these initiatives? And if you do see potential, who needs to do what to realize that potential? And maybe also, to what extent can this be done by remote sensing, or we need other tools? So, Minnie, over to you.
Okay. Gawi say agut ako in. I have to greet you in my language as required by my people. But yes, listening yesterday to all the data that was being presented, I feel that there is a role for data to increase the potential of indigenous peoples to negotiate better deals. However, this data has to be generated with the indigenous peoples themselves so that it is clear that the data being generated responds to the realities of the indigenous peoples and also responds to the needs of the carbon market. What I see that is not happening, there's a lot of talk about including indigenous peoples in all these processes, but it's not happening. It's only being said over and over and over again, and I feel that by saying it, they feel that it's happening, but it's not happening. Funders do not give funds directly to indigenous people so that we can generate our own data based on our own needs and understandings. And also scientists do not come to the communities to discuss this data. So on the question whether this is going to be done remotely, yes, definitely there are data that needs to be gathered remotely, but the value of such data is best appreciated on the ground with the participation of the people who needs that information, as well as who have the rights over that information. So I would like to make a call to scientists to spend some time dialoguing with indigenous communities. There is a lot that you have learned, but there is still a lot that you haven't learned. And this can only be learned by actual dialogue with indigenous peoples. For instance, cultural changes that happen are affecting climate change mitigation activities. The loss of our languages affects our ability to adapt and mitigate climate change. And this is not being measured. What is being measured is trees being cut. And yet you do not know the value of the tree that is being cut by my people because we need to use it. So you just put a tree has been cut. It doesn't say what is the value of that to the community. And we lose a lot of things by not looking at that holistic view and understanding these different relations. So again, my call is for more inclusive processes of data gathering, and the use of data should be very respectful to those who own that data. And maybe scientists do not think that the indigenous peoples own this data, and yet simply because they have nurtured their environment, we do have a say on this data. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Minnie. I'm going to now turn to Rosalind Adjei. She's the one who has to leave for the airport, so privileging her for early answers here. And Rosalind works for the Ghana Forestry Commission and is the Director of Climate Change there, as well as the National Red Plus Coordinator. She's been with the Commission for 16 years, and her career has spanned sustainable forest management activities, and 13 of those years have been spent working actively on climate change mitigation and adaptation. I've gotten to know Rosalind in the context of our joint service on the board of the Architecture for Red Plus Transactions. And I can tell you, she's a tough board member, you know? She asks the hard questions. I asked her for a fun fact, and you'll love this. She said she has dreams of becoming a talk show host, as well as a fashion house brand icon for sustainable brands. And for those of you who've been monitoring her outfits over the last couple of days, you know, she's there. You know, if something goes wrong with the Forestry Commission, she's got another job, just, you know, right off the get-go. So, Rosalind, assuming you're not too nervous looking at your watch about when the taxi's coming, I want to ask you to follow up on Minnie's point about equitable sharing of benefits, because I know Ghana has distinguished itself in its National Red Plus program in doing the benefit sharing thing. So I just wonder if you want to speak to the question in this geospatial data and monitoring in supporting Ghana's efforts for equitable benefit sharing.
Thank you very much, Frances, and good morning to everybody. Yes, I'm not looking at the time, so the phone is turned upside down. So to follow up on what Minnie said, I mean, data in general is very, very important within the work that we do on Red Plus and forest management and getting results for avoided deforestation or reducing deforestation and forest degradation. What we have come to realize is that the format of that data, again, going back to what Minnie was saying, is sometimes where the issue is. Because, for example, I see myself in my office engaging with the FAO all the time. We have to meet, you need a laptop, you are doing some selection of areas, looking at plots, comparing. Question is, how many indigenous people or local people will have that time to sit in that room and use that laptop over so many hours? And even for people who claim they are technical people who've done GIS, done remote sensing, degree, second degree, PhD, it doesn't come that simple. So maybe we should be gravitating towards a point where we have data that's simplified enough and has a very simplified process that can involve a lot more other stakeholders, particularly indigenous people and local communities. Because for the jurisdictional work that we are doing, now we are doing program accounting, a program level accounting, so we say we have been able to generate results over a 5 million hectare area. Now, what is tricky in there is that you are rewarding for results over 5 million hectares, but we are not able to really disaggregate per smallholder, and that's our case, because you have a lot of smallholders, and the whole Red Plus process is voluntary, so you are calling on farmers to come join, to adopt climate smart practices, and the question is, to what extent do you measure these climate smart practices? Somebody might be applying 2 of those practices, another might be applying 3 of those practices. You can have farmers who are just even writing their names for the sake of a program coming on board. So I believe that the real value of the geospatial data and where we are getting to is to be able to disaggregate per location, per smallholder, so we can really reward for the effort that farmers are putting in. Because if we have to purchase any farm inputs and we are purchasing them across board for every farmer, but the efforts of different farmers are not the same, then we are not really rewarding the local communities as we should be. And before we can get to such a place, we need to be able to build capacity, to train, not just government officials, not just civil society entities, but train local communities, understand who even wants to be trained, and also complement that remote sensing space with ground truthing. It's very, very important because you have local communities being in touch with the resources at every point in time. So what is the place of ground truthing as well? But ground truthing again becomes important when you are assessing issues such as forest degradation, because degradation is not the same as deforestation. When you're assessing deforestation, remote sensing, you are easily detecting a land use change. Forest degradation is not a complete land use change. And you need timely data, you need hands-on data. And Frances, you mentioned timely when you were giving your opening remarks. If we are not able to detect degradation at a timely pace, you go in 1 year after, and then the area has increased. But if we had the systems in place, the structures to be able to detect maybe 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, then you don't have to wait for a year or 2 within a reporting period to the Carbon Fund in the case of Ghana before you're able to detect that these areas have gone through degradation rather than deforestation. So I believe that once we have geospatial data set up in a space, in a place where it is useful to local communities, it will help us to reward really the real actors who are generating emission reductions. It will ginger a lot more support from people who are not really generating that much but have been benefiting. And it should also be set up to function in a timely manner and to train whoever is needed to do that. Thank you.
I hope that you're documenting your experience so that it can be shared with other countries, because this is pioneering work. So looking at the clock, I'm going to ask you one more question, Rosalind, and then allow you to go. So Rosalind and I and Minnie and several other people were at a session yesterday morning where we talked about all the non-carbon benefits of forests for the climate. And here we're talking about how forest evapotranspiration functions and how forest canopies affect wind turbulence and how they emit biogenic volatile organic compounds and create cloud cover that reflects sunlight. And in all those ways, tropical forests especially cool the whole planet, but they also cool locally and generate rainfall across scales. So all kinds of non-carbon benefits for the climate. And I have an intuition that if we could do a better job of quantifying those benefits, putting a price tag on them and being clear like at what spatial scale they benefit, we could actually move towards monetizing them and incorporating them more in the allocation of climate finance as well as potentially these market mechanisms. So I want to turn to Rosalind again and ask, do you agree with me? I mean, is there potential here? What's the next step? What would you do based on your policymaking role to make demands on the forest data and monitoring community to help you do that?
Thank you, Frances. Yes, there is really an opportunity, but my question will be, to what extent are the expectations for that opportunity? Because let's consider carbon. We've traveled through a very long space to get into measurements of carbon, greenhouse gas inventories, establishing reference levels for REDD+ implementation. And many people in this room might possibly have heard that for tropical forest countries, we are saying that the price of carbon at the moment is not what it is. We should be paying more because forest carbon credits are not like energy credits. It takes so much. We are talking about people's livelihoods. You're talking about changing behaviors. It's not just like going to set up a solar panel. It's way different. But we are not able to attract the right price as it is now. And so that's why I find the value in the not just carbon discussion. Probably providing us with a justification that, okay, the forest is not just about carbon, it's doing other things. Why don't we compensate or reward for these other things? But I'm also careful not to get into the space where we introduce different bottlenecks of requirements. So somebody is going to ask, how do we measure these other benefits? Are we going to quantify them? Can it be like carbon that's quantified? And when I think through, my point is that data is never going to be enough, but data is also needed. Because I don't see WRI stopping the work that it does, ever. So at every point in time, some sort of data is going to be needed. But what we do with that data at that point in time, I think, is what is very necessary. Yesterday, the report came out, countries that still have deforestation or degradation ongoing. These reports have been coming on year. What have we done about those reports? Has anybody ever stopped to think that, well, Ghana is mentioned in there. What is Ghana doing right? I have been seen on so many panels talking. Why is it that we still have degradation or deforestation in our primary forests? Have we used that data to support Ghana in any way, or we still have requirements from Ghana, even though we have that data, to go through some verification, validation process? But the Global Forest Watch data is not going through any verification, validation process, as is expected for REDD+ credits. So there's a lot that data can do. I am all for that. But I think that we have to be systematic with the data that we get and work towards a stepwise improvement. So if this is what we have today, and we realize that there are other climate benefits, can we come to a consensus on what we can reward today for those climate benefits? And maybe have a benchmark that in 2 years, we should be able to quantify these climate benefits, maybe on a regional scale, maybe on a country scale in 5 years, maybe on a certain global scale in some 10 years or so. And so you are progressively rewarding farmers, rewarding smallholders, rewarding governments for their efforts. But if we want to get to a perfect state, then we are still going to have the year-on-year Global Forest Watch reports that are showing that there is deforestation, and nobody is really using that data to support the countries to get to where they have to be. So that's sincerely my take on this, that data can do what it can do, but we also need to understand that data is always going to improve, and we have to make the best use of what we have per time. Thank you.
So I'm going to excuse Rosalind, and we're going to send her out the door with a big round of applause, and I want you to clap commensurate with your sense that she has a career as a talk show host. Thank you, Rosalind. All right. Yeah, thanks, Shawnee. Come a little closer. Okay. Our next panelist is Viviana Zales, who is a colleague of mine at World Resources Institute, where she's a research associate in the Forest and Land Program. And her research focuses on the use of, what else, remote sensing, to assess land cover and land cover change monitoring, and particularly in the context of tropical deforestation. And the fun fact about Viviana is, despite her professional endeavors, apparently you should not ask her for directions if you get lost on the way back to the hotel from this venue, because she's totally hopeless with spatial orientation when she's on her own.
Working on it.
Working on it. Oh, sorry, I have that in my notes. She's working on it. Viviana, I'm going to give you a little extra time. First, to start out, any reaction you want to have to what Rosalind just said about the utility of data and measurement of these non-carbon effects, and then go on to focus in on a specific issue that Rosalind mentioned, and that is the monitoring of degradation. Because my primitive understanding of one of the big challenges in the forest carbon crediting world is this issue of uncertainty in measuring the emission reductions from reducing deforestation and degradation. And that if we take degradation into account in particular, that uncertainty is harder to bring down. So for the layperson, maybe you could explain to us why that's a problem and what the prospects are for dealing with it. So Viviana, over to you.
Thank you, Francis. So I will focus in terms of responding actually a very nice segue from Rosalind on this issue of uncertainty, which is key for all of the carbon markets to even scale. So when we're talking about uncertainties related to carbon fluxes from deforestation or restoration activities, there's these two components that we need to be thinking about. There's the area of forest loss and gain, and there's the carbon that's associated with those forests. On the area side, I think we're doing pretty well. The carbon standards have really kind of come up to speed with the latest science and are requiring us to use statistical methods for assessing deforestation, which is what's considered good practice in our field. So we're not just making maps and counting pixels, but we're actually using probability sampling techniques to assess deforestation, and that gives us a measure of uncertainty that's associated with the area of deforestation. And those standards actually have really strict thresholds on what we need to meet for uncertainties for area estimation. The challenge here is that actually implementing these methods is really hard. It's really not a trivial task. And yesterday, Rebecca Moore in the plenary called for geographers and subject matter experts to come together with software engineers and AI experts to develop geospatial solutions that will drive change. And Minnie and Rosalind today called for indigenous peoples and local communities to also be included in the process of making the data. I would add a pitch for adding some more statisticians into the mix, because these are really challenging, difficult technical challenges, and we need people in the room who understand the wide variety of tools that are at our disposal to really lower these uncertainties. So that's on the area side. I think we're doing pretty well. We can do better. On the carbon side, it's a little bit trickier. We really don't yet have a great understanding of how much carbon is stored in tropical forests across the globe. And we do need further targeted investments and research into field sites, inventory plots, research sites, permanent research sites, LiDAR data, trying to build up this understanding of carbon from the ground up and integrating it with top-down measurements from remote sensing to drive down the uncertainties on carbon. And on the degradation side, this is particularly challenging. I mean, monitoring degradation, as was mentioned by Rosalind, is a really difficult task at the moment with the remote sensing data that's at our disposal. But I think the idea is that if we have a very precise estimate of area, and then we multiply that by a carbon estimate that's really not really precise and is kind of murky, our final estimate is also going to be kind of murky. So we shouldn't just focus on one side. There's urgency on the other side. But overall, with the question of uncertainty, I think that it's really it's really highly correlated with cost and time. So if I have all the money in the world and all the time in the world, I can do great things for reducing uncertainty of carbon fluxes. But we don't have that. We have this urgency to really scale carbon markets to unleash the potential that they have to try to drive down deforestation rates. And if we want to do that, we need to expect and maybe get comfortable with certain levels of uncertainty. And I think that's kind of what Rosalind was talking about as well, with all the added other more than carbon benefits. It's like we have a certain understanding. Is that good enough for us to get started? And the measurements and the uncertainties are going to come down as research gets better, as data get better, and as we are able to employ these methods in a more robust way.
So remember, those of you who were at the tree cover release thing, what's it called? Tree cover loss launch yesterday? Yeah. Say that 3 times fast. I said what a great pleasure it was to work with all the bright young women and WRI's Global Forest Watch and Forest Monitoring. Is another one. Okay, thanks, Viviana. Now I'm going to turn to a bright young man. Another colleague, Sean DeWitt, who is the director of WRI's Global Restoration Initiative. And I know that the restoration folks were feeling that they weren't getting enough love yesterday at the plenary session, so we're going to make up for it now. Stop nodding, Tracy. Come on. Whose side are you on? Okay. So what Sean's role is, including extraordinary fundraising, by the way, speaking of financing, is that he's the one who inspires and supports and mobilizes partners to restore forests and degraded lands, and he's actively coordinating among governments, the civil society, communities, small and medium enterprises, to make sure that these efforts deliver benefits, across the board, climate, nature, people. The fun fact and tip about Sean is don't ever rent an apartment beside Sean's, because he disclosed to me that every Wednesday night at, get this, 11 p.m., he takes ragtime piano lessons from a piano player at Disneyland. Is that right? Yeah, who knew? So if you like the piano banging at 11, he's your neighbor. All right. So Sean, as you know, I focus more on the protection side, so I kind of do remote sensing of the restoration agenda. But my understanding is that restoration challenges are somewhat different, and in fact maybe are more challenging in this space, in that they have more upfront financing needs. They rely on relatively more specific site-based activities. You can't plant forests at jurisdictional scale. But also they may have a broader set of objectives that need to be monitored in a particular place. So tell us more about how the whole geospatial data and monitoring thing can help support your agenda.
Great. Thank you, Francis. Yeah, I didn't know a piano could sound like that until I met that guy. It's unbelievable. Well, first, we do see restoration as the other side of the conservation coin. And I think that when you get into the landscapes, the conservation and restoration are happening in tandem. They're just inseparable. And I think we as a community can do a lot more to really bring these topics together. But they do have some nuanced attributes, as you mentioned, Francis. We often hear that the public sector has some comparative advantage in working on conservation, while the private sector has some comparative advantage working on restoration. And I think that that's not always the case, but I think there is some merit to that argument. But as we think about private finance, we recognize that that same report that you mentioned in the beginning, Francis, there's 56% of climate finance and only 14% of nature finance coming from the private sector. So in particular, in restoration, we feel like there's a lot more we could and should be doing here. So I just wanted to mention 5 quick things that keep me up at night, in an excited way and in a worried way, as we think about how to get more of this finance into restoration. Number 1 is dealing with the diversity. When we say restoration, it's a pretty big tent, actually. There's a lot of different things that you could be doing: reforestation, agroforestry, silvopasture, riparian restoration, mangroves. These are all quite different things, and geospatially, there's just different ways we have to measure them, and I think sometimes we treat them as one community of practice. And I think a call to action to myself and to everyone here is, can we create distinct communities of practice that can really get good at measuring each of those things in the landscapes? The second thing is we need to make sure that we're looking back in order to move forward. And this is really about a geospatial historical look at what's happened to a certain patch of land before restoration comes in. And this can be really, really important as we think about restoration and conservation being mutually reinforcing. They can be, or restoration can undermine conservation. And that look back can be an important factor. And I'll give you one example. A very well-intentioned and large policy in Mexico called Sembrando Vida was doing an agroforestry subsidy. And its first iteration didn't have this look back, right? And so if you don't look back, you could have an agroforestry subsidy that is encouraging you to clear a forest in order to create an agroforest. So it doesn't say, yesterday was it a forest? A year ago was it a forest? 5 years ago. So this kind of look back is absolutely key geospatially to know if this is the right time and place to do the right kind of restoration. The third is defining your boundaries, which actually can be a little bit harder than it sounds. Restoration, as you mentioned, Francis, restoration often involves projects. Projects have boundaries. And with that, what we've noticed, I'll give you one example. So if you're a restoration practitioner and you're reaching out to the community and you're saying, we have a wide range of native species we want you to plant. Are you interested, Farmer X? Farmer X says yes. Farmer Y says, no, I'm gonna wait and see what Farmer X does. Farmer Z says yes. And you do this across hundreds of farmers in a community. You end up with a bit of a patchwork, right? So your question is, for your shapefile, for your boundary, do you have 300 little boundaries, or do you have one, knowing that you had 56% uptake in that area, right? So this is just an area that we're innovating as a team now, and really trying both methods and really understanding, what can we see, what are we trying to measure, what are we trying to verify against as we look inside these boundaries. And getting these boundaries is really important, because if you're looking in the wrong place, you're always gonna have the wrong data. always. The fourth point, technology is amazing. I think we're here, we're seeing all these new data sets. I won't get into the details here, but it's getting a lot more granular, which is really important for us on restoration. We're doing some of this work at WRI under John Brandt's leadership, Dave Skoll at Michigan State, the GLAD Lab at University of Maryland. We're working together with Tracy and her team at Meta and the Data for Good team. There's just so much happening, so this is super exciting. But which brings me to my fifth point, which is kind of echoing Minnie and Rosalind and Viviana, which is that while technology is amazing, let's not forget about people as part of the solution too. It doesn't make the solution less pure, right? And science and research has always been done without a degree of high technology. It's not always the shiny thing that can show us what's happening. We have some good methodologies that can work on the ground, especially in the early years of restoration, while we're looking at seedlings and very small things. We need to have a way that we nurture this human and technology interface, right? And as an example, like for us, with some of our restoration work in Africa, the best solutions in Africa create jobs too, right? And so actually, rather than seeing it as a limitation of the technology, we see it as a fantastic opportunity to create jobs that are good jobs, exciting jobs that do have a technology interface to them that will attract young people to these kinds of jobs. And we hope that we can focus on this interface more and make these kind of solutions that do have the best of technology and the best of human networks feel more legitimate. So those are the 5 things that keep me awake, keep me excited. And I think there's just so much more we can do with geospatial monitoring of both restoration and conservation together in the landscapes.
Thanks, Sean. That was incredibly well organized. So next I'm going to turn to Tracy Johns. She is the Carbon Removal Program Lead at Meta. And she's an expert in climate finance that has pretty much occupied every niche in this ecosystem, as far as I can tell. I mean, over the last 15 years. Tracy and I bonded on a road trip across Kalimantan a few years ago, so I came to appreciate all of the places she's been in her career. So she's been in, policy roles. She's been involved in project development. She was at a multilateral development bank for a while. I got to know her as a philanthropic role for a number of years, and now she's emerged as a corporate buyer of these credits. And her fun fact is that she actually started in this field the year that the Kyoto Protocol came into force, and so has been following the story ever since then. And she discloses that this is her very first international business trip since the pandemic. So be gentle with her. She's still feeling her way, We want her to come back. So before asking you to comment on restoration in particular, I want you to just step back a little bit, Tracy, and just give us a sense of, from the perspective of a buyer of carbon credits in this instance, but any unit of an asset related to nature, how important is the geospatial data and monitoring in terms of building your confidence as a buyer in the environmental and social integrity of the asset that you're buying? And any specific examples that come to mind from your experience that would really illustrate this point?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Thank you, Francis. And it's really great to be here with you all. Thanks to WRI for the invitation to join you all. So I think when I think about my role over the past couple of years, kind of transitioning from other areas that I've worked in this space to a buyer of carbon credits, I think reflecting on the value of geospatial data and the impacts that it can have in my work, I immediately think first of claims integrity. And we are facing in the broader sort of carbon market space, and in particular around nature-based solutions, some real criticism and skepticism. Terms like tree washing, greenwashing, being used quite a lot to describe the ways that companies and other actors in the space are taking advantage of the use of carbon markets and carbon projects. And so I think for companies like Meta, for ambitious companies who have made serious net zero commitments and are really focusing on reductions first, but don't want to just ignore those residual emissions that can't be completely eliminated, don't want to just leave those to be unaddressed, we need access to quality carbon market projects in order to zero out those residual emissions until we can eliminate them ourselves. And for that, we need a carbon market with integrity and transparency that we can lean on for that element of our net zero pathway. And because of the timelines and the sort of urgency of action and the sort of timing of many of these commitments, we need to rely on nature-based solutions. That's going to be the bulk of what's available and what can come online on time and can contribute meaningfully to that element of net zero pathways. So for me, the sort of advent of geospatial monitoring at the granularity and sort of time cadence that we are beginning to realize is a key to unlock that transparency and integrity that we need in order to really maximize private sector investment in nature-based solutions and the ability of the land sector to be maximized in the way that it contributes to climate change mitigation overall. If we do truly believe that public finance won't bring us all the way there, then we need that private finance. Carbon markets are one of the major ways that finance comes into play. And without that transparency and integrity, that system is at risk. And engaging in carbon markets for companies becomes riskier, and that dampens investment in those absolutely vital projects, as Francis noted, has happened already in the last year or two. So I think that's one area where I think the geospatial data can really transform the way that companies engage in climate mitigation. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, and actually one thing I didn't mention in my intro is that I think it's today, isn't it, Roman, that the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative is launching its claims guidance. So Tracy's point about integrity of corporate claims is like live today as an important part of the discourse. Tracy, before I let you set down the mic, let me invite you to zoom in on restoration in particular. I know that your company is in the business of purchasing removals only, which we'll forgive you for now. But what you want to build on Sean's remarks about the particular challenges and opportunities related to the restoration agenda?
Yes. When I sort of bring this question down to the level of focusing in on forests, and I would like to say, since Francis noted it, Meta has made a decision to focus on removals in our carbon offset program. It is not in any way a reflection on our sense of the importance of the work of avoided emissions and avoided deforestation activities. We firmly believe in those and really applaud the actors and companies and implementers who are working on the ground to increase the integrity and effectiveness of those programs as well. So just want to make that clear. When I think about this in terms of restoration, I think of a couple of things. I think about one of the several sort of carbon market elements that besets nature-based solutions and restoration as well as a subset of that. That is the question of durability. There's a sort of raging debate within the carbon markets, and in particular with those focused on removals, about durability and how to define durability across different project types. And in my mind, given the fact that forests not only absolutely have to be a permanent climate solution, we can't meet our climate goals without them. We can't substitute other types of carbon removal for them. We need them to be a perpetual solution, so the question of permanence and durability shouldn't even be a question. We don't have the option of forests not being permanent. So given that, to really address the questions around, can the project that I'm supporting or the forest that I'm investing in be durable and permanent, the ability to monitor that forest for the long term at a reduced cost and an increased granularity and sort of time sequence can begin to really address that question of durability. And we don't have to try to guess up front how durable a solution is. We can monitor it. And we can stop thinking about monitoring for 20 years and start thinking more about the timescales that will be really important for longer-term climate mitigation, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. And those are the kinds of systems that are being developed now so that we can put that question of durability aside and focus on making each project as durable and addressing those durability risks. And then the other piece I think about is some of the barriers that we see for carbon market access for small-scale community-led projects. These are the types of projects that, as Meta, when we find them and are able to work with them, it is like the golden prize. These are the projects that are designed with the implementers and the communities on the ground first, identifying their needs and what they want to do in a project and layering carbon on top of that. When you find those projects as a buyer, it's really like it is the golden prize. Unfortunately, carbon markets have been set up in a way that create barriers for these types of projects to access carbon market finance. And one of them is monitoring both the financial cost that it's included and the technical and technological barriers that exist for these smaller scale communities. And so I believe that bringing this type of geospatial monitoring at a global scale, at a consistent way, at a level of granularity that matters for community-based projects, this opens the door for these projects to access carbon market finance in a way that hopefully can transform the ways that projects are developed and the ways that buyers can support these types of projects. And so this is an area where our collaboration with WRI is really focused. How can we bring this type of monitoring to small-scale community-led projects and unlock their potential to access carbon market finance early enough in the stage of project implementation that it matters. It allows these projects to get off the ground and get that early stage finance. When the trees grow, we can see it and we can start paying for that benefit. So for me, that's the most important and sort of exciting aspect of these monitoring approaches, is unlocking carbon market access for those who have been kept from it by those barriers.
Great, thanks. And I noted your use of the term durability instead of permanence, and I think that's a shift in language that would be salutary for the whole carbon market community. Thanks for that. So I'm not seeing a bunch of questions coming in on the Slido, so could you guys get busy, because we're about to transition into the, participatory part of this, so please, give me a few more choices. I'm going to ask one more question to the panel that I had prepared before turning to the submitted questions, and that is to balance the scales a little bit between our discussion of the carbon market context, which is the one that exists now, so it's the one we talk about more, but I also want to give due attention to the biodiversity one. We've been working on the REDD+ thing for like 15 years and trying to sort out all the issues with measurement and monitoring of carbon. And I have this dim intuition that biodiversity might be even harder. And yet, at the Gabon summit I mentioned, and apparently last week in Paris, everybody's talking about, like biodiversity credits. And so I'm curious, for those who have expertise in biodiversity on our panel, and I'm looking at you, Minnie, tell us a little bit about, how biodiversity is different than carbon, and what you see as the prospects for either being able to monitor and quantify biodiversity status and fluxes that could support a market in biodiversity credits, or at least adding a biodiversity value, like stacking it on top of carbon credits. So tell us.
I'm the most skeptic about this. And I was complaining actually because there's this huge drive to create standards about biodiversity credits, and they are pulling left and right indigenous leaders to be part of this. And it's like, we don't even understand carbon credits, and now you're talking about biodiversity credits. But to be honest, when I first heard about it, I said, I think that is more inclusive than carbon, and I think it's more in keeping with how indigenous peoples look at the world. We do not look at our trees as a carbon sink per se, but we look at it in its whole holistic thing. So it's more including the other biodiversity values of the forest and not just carbon. But it does give us a lot of concern, primarily because the carbon market has not been very good. And now we worry that we haven't even perfected that, and now we're entering into a much more broader scope. And I have a question about how do you value, for instance, different indigenous peoples value different trees. and how much more when scientists come in. So there cannot be just one value for one specific tree or one specific carabao. When I was in Kenya, they were saying the carabao is the fiercest animal, and yet in the Philippines, it's the best friend of a farmer. And so there are different values depending on how you use it. So there is an opportunity there, and it is more in keeping with how indigenous peoples value the world, more inclusive. But for as long as it's not including indigenous people's perspectives, I fear that we might actually be creating more issues for indigenous peoples. And just another appeal for those who are into standard making. Indigenous peoples are already very busy defending their territories from many threats. Please do not bother us with these so many different standards left and right. Why can't you guys come together and coordinate? It is really pulling indigenous peoples away from the very valuable work that we're doing on the ground. And I'm not saying that standards are bad per se. The problem is if they are all created here at the global level, they do not matter on the ground, because what matters is how they are being implemented on the ground. So yes, good, you have a standard and you can talk about it until the end, but if it's not being implemented, it doesn't work. So an appeal for all of those who love standards, can you get together to coordinate so that there's only one process rather than there's one here, there's another, and all of you want indigenous peoples to be in those panels. So just an appeal, sorry.
I think that comment struck a nerve. This is the first spontaneous applause we've gotten, Minnie, so you're onto something here. So you did respond to my request, and the questions and comments are starting to come in on the Slido. Let's see. I'm actually not sure I understand the intent in some of these, so I'm going to articulate them, and then if they're not clear to the potential those who are being asked to answer, we might actually take a microphone into the audience if you're willing to identify yourself to explain what you meant. Let's see. Here's one on restoration. I agree with Sean that jobs are the way to get buy-in to improved stewardship. How do we ensure that data collectors on the ground are getting feedback from the data they collect? You mean on job creation? Or on... Yeah?
I can clarify.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of great work in getting the data and plotting things, but the data collectors are not here. They're not here seeing the outcomes, seeing what their data is going towards, and letting them know that the work that they are doing on the ground is actually going
Got it. Got it. Okay, so for the translators, in case they didn't hear that outside of the mic, the point is that people who actually are collecting the data aren't here at conferences like this, and how do they get the feedback on how the data they're collecting is being used? Like, for example, in the context of job creation? Is that the link?
Well, they're creating, the jobs are created.
Oh, at their jobs?
Their jobs are created,
okay.
But they need to get feedback that they're doing well at their job.
Okay. All right. Does anybody want to comment on that, Sean? Yeah?
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think a lot of times field-based data collection can be very extractive. And it's often for the financier, whether that's a donor or an investor, and that data doesn't make it back into the field. And I think it makes for really inefficient field operations a lot of times too, because sometimes you're visiting the same area over and over again, and you don't really have that history of what's been happening. You're just there collecting a survey, right? And I think especially as you start interacting with people and as we start to get better at measuring the socioeconomic impact, like just knowing like the history of that interaction with that household and knowing that it's really, really important, right? And so I think as we design our products and our solutions, we have to really think about that audience way more carefully and really prioritize that audience more than we do, because as long as this is extractive, we're talking a lot about equity in our kind of solutions. We're just not going to get there, right? And I think that's why we have to see this as a real partnership between the technologies and the people on the ground, and have a symbiotic positive feedback loop that just continues, or we're not going to make it.
Tracy, you want to add on?
Yeah, just one point I'd like to add. I think that's a great call out. And I was actually thinking, I think that Rosalind and Minnie both made some great points about the relevance of the data that's collected. And it is true that the data that projects are focused on collecting is to support the integrity of a transaction. It's very focused on the market and the transaction between the buyer and the seller. And there hasn't been enough thought given to what types of criteria and indicators are most important for the communities implementing the project. And it's not that it hasn't been tried at all. There are standards out there that are meant to focus on that are meant to try and capture data, things like the Community and Climate and Biodiversity Standard, the SDG, SD Vista, that are trying to focus more on the local social and environmental impacts. But I wonder if we couldn't tailor those a bit more, especially as we're designing geospatial systems to collect these data, to just include some criteria and indicators in every project that are developed by the community to make sure that that monitoring system is also capturing those data, and that buyers are aware and can also see that a project has paid attention to the indicators that are most important to the community, and that can go into the reporting as well. Why couldn't we just add a section that's really focused on the information, that instead of assuming we know what the communities want and putting it into a standard, actually asking and including that?
So I think you just answered another question that's in the queue, but let me articulate it just in case you want to add. It says, for Tracy, is your company engaging with any specific projects to explore ways to use technology in forest projects and going beyond a commercial relationship?
Great question. It's as if I planted it. I didn't. Yes, and it's some of the most exciting work that I get to work on. So thank you for the question. When we work with projects, the dream is to work with a project that is grounded in a community vision for management of land and is led by that community. And we as buyers and sort of working with the project designer are designing the project around that as the foundation for the project. It is absolutely wonderful when we have the opportunity to work directly with that community or project developer and get to be a part of that design process and support through other ways aside from just committing to buying the credits. So there are a couple of examples of that which we feel very sort of honored to be a part of. One is we made a commitment to the 1T.org platform, a partnership commitment with the National Indian Carbon Coalition, which represents tribal nations in North America, to develop new carbon projects on tribal lands in North America. And in that partnership, we're bringing to the table not only a commitment to help develop these projects and buy the credits down the line, but also to bring some of the monitoring techniques that we're working on with WRI to the table in case those are of value to the tribes that are implementing the projects. We would love to be able to bring some of the power of our platforms to these projects at times when that is a sort of desired and sort of good fit. We try to do that as well. And then the other example is the work that we're doing with WRI focused on the AFR 100 program, where we are taking a look at the AFR 100 entrepreneurs and those projects and working together to identify which ones could be successful in achieving carbon market finance, and then working directly with that project to sign a long-term contract to purchase credits and help them develop the project, again, starting with the sort of premise that AFR 100 starts with, which is entrepreneurs bringing their ideas to the project. And then we look afterwards to see if carbon could be a good fit, rather than the other way around, where you're sort of scanning the globe to see where the best carbon benefits are, then trying to sell a project. So yes, when we have the chance to do that, that is the best part of the work that we do.
So I'm starting to get paranoid that you do have some way to infiltrate the Slido thing, because you've just anticipated another question that was here, which is good point about including more stakeholders like indigenous communities into data analysis processes. Can you provide experiences on how best to do this? And it seems like that the North American commitment is part of that. But if you want to say more, do so, and then I'll turn to Minnie to embroider on that question.
I guess the only thing I'll say is I don't see why we couldn't. We're building these really technical systems to capture data at really granular levels, and we're trying to develop them in a way that they're not only focused on carbon, they're focused on local environmental and social impacts as well. There's no reason why we can't tailor that even more to the specific project and include criteria and indicators that get incorporated into the monitoring plan that are specifically focused on what the community wants to monitor, and make that a part of the reporting and verification. And I would love to see that. And we would, personally prioritize projects like that and recognize that those things cost more and they're worth the price.
Minnie, you want to jump in?
Yeah. Just a caveat that the Kawari Fund is very recently launched, so we do not have actual projects yet, but it is the vision. For instance, we want to ensure that the social processes related to jurisdictional RED projects are of good quality, that they are actually being done. Because like I said, there are standards for free prior informed consent, but is it happening? So I think one of the things that we can work on, if we have the data of the number of the tons of carbon sequestered in one jurisdiction, that should be made available to the community so that they know, and also the price of carbon. So then they know exactly what is being discussed at the negotiations. And this is what Kawari Fund would fund, is that process of informing the communities of these different transaction elements related to RED+. At the moment, despite all the standards, there is no real free prior informed consent being done with communities because, one, the price of carbon is not being disclosed. Two, the tons of carbon that is being sequestered is not being told them. So how much other information is not being divulged to the community? So Kawari, the fund that we're trying to start off granting next month, hopes to ensure that the social integrity is upheld so that communities can have more time to do their own consultations, their discussions. And the great thing about Kawari is that we do not assume that the consultations will lead to a deal on carbon. They can eventually say, no, this is not for us. So this is what we mean by integrity, is giving the option to the community to say yes. And when they say yes, they are fully aware of what they are saying yes to. And if they say no, that they know what they are saying no to. The whole red carbon market has become so convoluted that some communities, when they hear the word red, are already like, no, we don't even want to have a discussion. So this is what we mean by integrity of the process. I'm sure that the environmental integrity is being taken care of by all this data, but it's the social integrity, it's the relationship building that is often left unfunded. There's no investment to make sure that the social processes are actually being done properly. At the end of the day, what we want to build are relationships. It shouldn't be just a transaction between a company and the community, but it should really be a relationship to ensure that there is permanence. It is that relationship that will ensure that the community will continue to take care of the forest if they know who they are relating to. So this is what we mean by social integrity in the process. And yes, we hope that that is an example of how this data can help free prior informed consent processes, which is a very, very important process of the whole carbon market system.
Essential. And just to be clear, the Kawari Fund is this new fund that's been established to support all the things that you've described at Rewild.
Yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, some of the funds were like part of the IPLC pledges from Glasgow, right? That's being channeled through this mechanism. So.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Can I just
Jump in?
respond?
Yep.
Yeah, real quick to that. So just bouncing off of a lot of things that I've heard, I think one of the key things for addressing some of the elements that we've talked about in terms of the transparency, integrity of the market, in terms of bringing higher, this more confidence from indigenous peoples of participating in these markets in an equitable way. And then further also with getting comfortable with like some level of uncertainty associated with carbon credits. I think one key thing is making sure that we are very open and transparent with our methods and with our data. So, you know, when we do all of this, we talk about data as power and, you know, who is making the data and all of this. But the flip side of that also is that making these data, producing these estimates and carbon fluxes, it's also a burden. And that's not something that you necessarily want to put on people. We've seen Sean's experience with this question of the polygons, the boundaries of all of these projects. Getting these project developers to even make a shapefile of the area where they're working has been a huge task for your team. And this is the most basic thing from the geospatial perspective, right? So there is this other component of like, what is the burden that we're putting on the local people to actually develop these data? And if we are saying we're gonna take on some of that burden, we're gonna develop the data, the way to really ensure that there is confidence in the process and that they, you know, people are aware of what are the methods that have been used, what are the decisions that have been made in creating these data, is just really having transparency and openness and in the methods, releasing all of the data, all the maps, all of the reference data, the field data, all of that stuff, so that we really understand, okay, this is the uncertainty, that's the reason. Or, you know, this is the price and this is the reason. And yeah, just want to mention that aspect. And currently in carbon markets, there are a lot of companies that are working on this. And part of the value proposition, I think, is keeping things closed. So, you know, to what extent can we be a little bit more open with that?
And that is a great segue to the next set of questions I'm going to pose. So we got several coming in asking about price and pricing. One question is, what is an acceptable price per ton of CO2 sequestered, and what factors should go into determining that price, and how does quality affect price? And then another point suggesting that this new demand for higher quality credits means that costs will go up for implementers in the near term before they go down, and how do we drive corporate willingness and other buyers to pay that higher price? And one more that just came in, looking at the price range of carbon credits, how could we get quality credits better recognizing biodiversity, including indigenous peoples, et cetera? So taking all those together on questions about price, anybody want to start with a comment about how carbon pricing works? Okay, she's reaching for the mic. The buyer perspective on pricing. Okay.
Yeah, so what's an acceptable price? I wish there were one answer for that. I think for us, so for a starting point, we purchase carbon removal credits across the spectrum from natural to technological. And if you pay attention to that sort of overall sector in the marketplace, you understand that there's a wide gap between the average price for engineered carbon removal and the average price for nature-based carbon removal. And there are all kinds of reasons touted as why that is, and you know, these are on the engineered side, new technologies that are needing to scale, starting very small, so there's an expense there to try to get them up to the scale that the price can come down and more buyers will purchase them. But one of the price differences that's sort of touted there is the durability issue. And these approaches are identified as being highly stable and highly durable forms of carbon removal that are unlikely to be reversed. And so they, you know, the sort of messaging is they deserve a higher price. I think that there's a lot that we can do in the nature-based solutions and nature-based carbon removal to address reversal risk. And these are, in many cases, human decisions to have that reversal. It's not some magic event that happens. You know, we do have fires, we do have some sort of events outside of human control that are becoming increasingly relevant for consideration. But the majority of reversals of forest loss are still human decisions that are being made. So that to me says there are things we can do to bring that reversal risk down. And paying for the activities that would bring that risk down is one way to do it. So I would like us to get a better understanding of what does it take to make a truly durable forest conservation project? What else would you need to do as a project to bring that reversal risk down? And then translate that into what would it cost? My guess is it would still be way under a lot of the prices in the engineered removal space. So that's one element. To step back from that argument, I think also for us, we want to understand what the costs are for developing the project. What are the sort of livelihood impacts of changes in behavior for changing the way that you relate to the forest or the land? There's usually a cost to that. If for example, that forest has been degraded because it's being used for agriculture or firewood or something like that, then switching that behavior comes with a cost. And we'd like to understand that cost when we think about what's the right price per ton to pay. You have also a lot of actors now in carbon markets that aren't directly project developers. You have sort of third-party brokers. There are a lot of actors in the space, and the more you bring sort of layers and actors in, the more the price goes up. Those actors are, in many cases, bringing really valuable services to carbon markets, but that also impacts what the price will be. Sort of how many layers is there between the buyer and the project is another sort of factor you have to take into account. And so there isn't one answer. You know, we also see, we're trying to do a lot of our purchases on long-term contracts that are, you know, 10 years long, 15 years long, because our net zero target fully comes into effect in 2030. And so we want to try to lock in that supply of credits in 2030 and beyond now. And so when you are adding in a sort of price certainty and commitment to buy certainty, that also affects the price rather than just going out and buying credits off the open market. So there isn't one price. Also, you know, the range of activities that Sean noted, everything from mangroves to sustainable forest, working forest management, to you know, natural forest regeneration. These all come with different costs of very different types of activities, very different types of investment needed in order to get them off the ground. So it really does take a lot of work to try to understand what's the right price to pay, what's the fair price to make sure you're increasing the durability, you're addressing durability risk, the communities are fairly compensated for the service they're provided and for the changes in behavior that are required, and that you're covering all of the services like monitoring and market sort of elements that get included in the project as well.
Any quick additions to what, Sean first, and then Minnie, and then we're going to be wrapping up soon, so.
Be brief.
Yep.
It is curious to me that it's a market where it's constrained on the supply side, yet the demand side is still setting the price.
Go figure.
So I think it's really important that we start to look at pricing through a different lens, which is from the ground up, and saying, at what price point does this smallholder farmer care about these trees that are on her land? And then build the price up from there, which may get us to $50 to $100 a ton. But as Tracy mentioned, still, if you look at the other alternatives that are out there, this could still be one of the most attractive things to do, and you're generating all these co-benefits as well.
So willingness to accept rather than willingness to pay determines the price. Minnie?
I think it's similar to that. Why is it that we are willing, my question is, can we not afford to pay the price? That question about making it more expensive for project developers, and it is always the social aspect that gets sacrificed, and all these other aspects get funding but not the social aspect. But my question is, if we do not do the social aspect well, then it is bound to fail. And by doing the social aspect well, we are actually ensuring the success of the project. So the question really is, are we willing not to invest in that? Can we afford not to invest in the social processes?
And it's certainly relevant to the durability point as well, right? As an element of quality, right? Okay. So we're down to the last couple of minutes just to acknowledge the many other questions I have in the queue that we won't be able to do justice for, but just quick answers. Back to uncertainty for a minute. What level of uncertainty, either absolute or relative, in carbon stock or carbon fluxes estimates are considered to be sufficient for the majority of use cases? Can you speak to that?
I don't know. I know for the area side of the equation, because that's what I'm more familiar with, carbon standards are requiring generally 10% uncertainty at the 90% confidence interval. This is actually a pretty strict requirement, and I do think that we should be a little bit flexible with this thing because sometimes just the statistics hit a certain limit, and to get from 11% to 10% might mean like 100% more effort. So, you know, being very transparent with the methods, again, going back to this idea and just being like, okay, we did everything the right way, but this is the uncertainty level that we hit. Is this okay? You know, I think there should be a little bit of room there. But on the carbon side, I actually am not sure. I'm sorry.
Okay. This is a big question, and if anybody has a pithy answer, have at it. So we've been talking about generating finance, more finance for the good stuff, and somebody points out that, you know, there's still a huge amount of finance flowing that damages nature. Is there anything the geospatial data and monitoring crowd can do to transform this financial system to stop the bad stuff as well as generating the good stuff?
That's your look back thing, Sean. I mean, I just think, yeah, again, it goes back to this idea that, like, you know, let's make sure that whatever incentives we've put in place to encourage restoration activities are not incentives to clear forests to access those, you know, restoration funds. So I think that's kind of one of the key things.
And a related question, in the same way that we used to talk about if you're only incentivizing conservation of carbon, you drive funding to the high carbon landscapes and not the low carbon landscapes, how might biodiversity credits disincentivize protection and restoration of lower biodiversity but socially and ecologically important ecosystems? How do we ensure we have the right balance? What can geospatial data and monitoring do to address that challenge?
I can't speak to that question directly. The one thing that I can say, and I'm not a biodiversity expert, and I haven't been deeply involved in the conversations around biodiversity credits. The only thing I would say is I don't want to see in land projects, carbon projects separated out from the biodiversity impacts that they can provide. So I'm a little concerned to see those get separated, because for us, we look at biodiversity as a very key indicator for whether we will support a project or not, and what the price should be for that, for the work that's going into the biodiversity conservation. I think there's a recognition in general that different ecosystems have different levels of biodiversity, and that, you know, a prairie project, for example, versus a tropical forest project is going to have different but equally important biodiversity. And my sense is, at least, that for a lot of buyers, that's understood, and it's not just the number of species, it's the sort of preservation of an important ecosystem that matters the most.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time, but you can choose to use your last 45 seconds as you wish. So what I'm going to do now is just close by asking each panelist to, you know, wearing the hat that they're wearing on this panel, tell us what's the one thing we discussed in the last hour and a half or failed to discuss that you think is the most important near-term opportunity for marshaling the resources of the 650 people who are gathered for this conference to solve a problem related to the issues we're talking about. Tell us what the problem is and who needs to do what to realize the potential for geospatial data and monitoring to solve it. So we're going to start with Viviana from the perspective of somebody who analyzes this stuff for a day job. Viviana.
Okay, and I'm going to answer, I think, not at all what you just talked about, but more like responding to Tracy with my 45 seconds. I think that part of the, you know, we're trying here to conserve and restore ecosystems that are extremely complex. We don't understand them, and the idea that we get to quantify them is really, really extremely hard. And we've chosen carbon kind of as a proxy of something that we can, you know, let's quantify this one thing, and then maybe that'll drive the investments. But that focusing on this one narrow thing sometimes can mean that we are doing the wrong thing for all of the other aspects that we're not quantifying, right? So I think just keeping this idea of nature, climate, and people, and if we have that perspective of like, okay, we're quantifying carbon, but we should be worrying about all these three aspects together when we're talking about the carbon market and scaling these things. Yeah, just from the probably more so from the demand side, because they're the ones buying the thing. It shouldn't be just about carbon.
Okay, we'll accept that answer. Minnie, same question to you from the perspective of indigenous peoples.
I think we should be discussing more the issue of equity. And I call on scientists to also bear in mind the other regions of the world and not just the carbon-rich regions or the key biodiversity areas. Often we focus too much on those carbon-rich areas to the detriment of other areas. And I ask the question, are we willing to sacrifice those other areas to preserve one carbon area? So I would like to see scientists also developing data sets on these smaller areas. And I come from a forest that is very small and would never appear in your maps. And yet it is as valuable to me as the Amazon is to the Amazon people. So I urge you, the question of climate change and biodiversity loss affects everyone and not just those big areas. So let us look at the globe and see what each area contributes and what is the potential of each. So even in finance, let's make sure that finance is equitably distributed to all regions of the world. So that's just my opinion.
From a buyer perspective.
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to leave with this. First of all, carbon markets and nature-based solutions have they've taken a beating over the last several months or longer. I would just like to say that there is nothing stopping someone who wants to develop a high-quality, high-integrity nature-based solutions project from doing that. The problem isn't that it's impossible to do. The problem is that we need the standards to tighten up to make a baseline high enough that every project that's verified is of that quality. But there's nothing stopping you as a project developer from addressing the sort of weaknesses in methodologies and still coming out with a project that's high integrity across the board. And there are buyers out there who are looking for those types of projects. And the other thing I'd like to say is that if you believe that nature-based solutions are an important aspect of climate mitigation and that corporate finance and carbon market finance are a key way for this to happen, speak up about it. It's not a foregone conclusion that this will remain a pathway that's viable for companies, for project developers. And if you don't speak up about it, and if we don't speak up about it as a community, it's at risk. So thank you.
Thank you. Sean, the last word.
Thanks, Francis. I think for me, I love that this conference is breaking down some of the walls between people that are producing data and people that need to use data. And I think we need to do more of that. And because I think a lot of times, especially in the open data space, like the data is amazing, but it's a little bit distant from market transactions. And we need more money into these solutions. We just do. And so I think what I'd love to see is what I mentioned earlier, a little bit of this kind of ground up approach of looking at it from starting with like the best of the locally led projects that we can find and really trying to understand and really have the rest of us there as supporting cast trying to figure out how can we bring the right data, geospatial data to the system? How can we make sure that the right certifications are understandable and these rules are understandable to the folks and just really start with the real work, which is that we have to do this work on the ground, and then the rest of us figure out how we can best support that work and just kind of shift the power balance in the equation.
Great. Well, you guys have been a great panel, and you guys have been a great audience. You know, I didn't get to use my dinger once. It's kind of a disappointment. But you also raised your hands when I asked you to, and you submitted questions when I asked you to. Very compliant crowd. Anyway, one last request. Join me in an applause for our great panelists. Ask them to stay up here for a couple minutes in case you want to come up and ask a follow-up question privately. Thank you.